Today, we're diving into a fascinating historical paradox. We're looking at India in the late 19th century. Picture this, a highly polite, incredibly proper group of loyal intellectuals, basically using the tools of prayer and petition. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a remarkably mild, almost passive way to challenge a global empire, right? But as we're going to discover today, this exact group, inadvertently, built the absolute rock-solid foundation for India's massive, radical, anti-imperialist struggle. To understand exactly how this happened, here is our agenda. 1. Birth of the Congress. 2. Safety valve or catalyst. 3. The moderate era. 4. The economic drain theory. 5. Reforms and government backlash. And 6. The unseen foundation. Section 1. Birth of the Congress. Gathering the intellectuals. Let's set the stage in the late 1870s and early 1880s, right when the groundwork was finally being laid for an all-India political organization. What's truly remarkable is the sheer speed of development once that initial spark was lit. After the preliminary Indian National Conferences in 1883 and 1885, the Indian National Congress held its very first session in Bombay in December 1885. It was a pretty modest start, attended by just 72 delegates, presided over by W.C. Bonnerjee, and guided by a retired English civil servant named A.O. Hume. But things moved fast. By 1890, Kadambini Ganguly, the very first woman graduate of Calcutta University, addressed the Congress. This was huge. It quickly began to symbolize a commitment to giving all sections of Indian society, absolutely including women, their rightful status in national life. Section 2, Safety Valve or Catalyst. Debating the origins. So, why was it actually founded? Let's unpack the fascinating debate surrounding its creation. There are actually two entirely opposing theories about the birth of the Congress. First, you've got the safety valve theory. Leaders like Lala Lajpat Rai and later Marx historians like R.P. Dutt firmly believed that A.O. Hume created the Congress specifically to release the growing, dangerous discontent of the Indian masses. Literally like a safety valve on a pressure cooker, right? The idea was to save the British Empire from a popular uprising. But contrast that with modern historians like Bipan Chandra, who argue for the lightning conductor theory. They suggest the early nationalist leaders were actually incredibly strategic. They knew that if Indians tried to start an all-India political body completely on their own, British officials would ruthlessly crush it. So, in a brilliant bit of historical irony, they used the British A.O. Hume as a lightning conductor, a catalyst who could absorb official hostility and allow them to safely build nationalistic forces right under the empire's nose. Section 3, the moderate era, aims and methods. The crucial point here is understanding exactly who these early leaders were, the ones we often call the moderates, and what they were actually trying to achieve between 1885 and 1905. Their core aims were incredibly methodical. Leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji, Firozshah Mehta, and Gopal Krishna Gokhale didn't want to violently overthrow the British overnight. That wasn't the plan. Instead, their goals were completely focused on building the nation from the ground up. They wanted to politicize and educate the people, develop a strong anti-colonial ideology, and formulate popular demands. But most importantly, they wanted to consolidate a real feeling of national unity, irrespective of religion, caste, or province. Basically, they were carefully nurturing the very concept of Indian nationhood itself. To actually achieve this, they relied on a highly specific methodology known as prayer and petition. Now, the moderates genuinely believed that the British inherently wanted to be just to Indians, but were simply unaware of the real harsh conditions on the ground. So their method was strictly constitutional agitation within the confines of the law. We're talking holding meetings, passing resolutions, and drafting these highly articulate petitions. The goal was to create strong public opinion in India, and then use that momentum to persuade both the British government and the British public to finally introduce reforms. Section 4. The economic drain theory. Uncovering the root cause. While prayer and petition might sound a bit passive, their most revolutionary contribution wasn't strictly political at all. It was actually a devastating economic critique of British imperialism. It really makes you wonder, how did they figure out why a historically wealthy, vibrant region was suddenly plunged into such deep, systemic poverty by the late 19th century? What was the actual root cause? Early nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji and R.C. Dutt basically acted like economic detectives. They proved that before colonial rule, India had a fully self-sufficient economy, but the British systematically transformed it. Suddenly, India was forced into becoming a mere supplier of cheap raw materials, a captive importer of finished manufactured British goods, and just a field of investment for British capital. This drain theory was absolutely monumental. Not only did it successfully create an all-India public opinion that the major cause of India's poverty was British rule itself, but it also formed the fundamental baseline for exactly how we understand the extractive nature of modern colonialism today. Section 5. Reforms and Government Backlash. The Shifting Tides. Armed with this powerful economic critique, the moderates started pushing hard for real legislative changes, but they quickly ran into a massive wall of British resistance. From 1885 to 1892, they essentially campaigned on the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." First, they demanded the expansion of legislative councils to include way more Indian participation. Then, they demanded actual reform of those councils, specifically asking for the power to control finances and the budget. And remarkably, this persistent pressure actually worked. It forced the British to grant concessions via the Indian Councils Act of 1892. This act increased the number of non-official members and introduced the principle of representation, even if it was highly restricted. Sure, it was a small step, but it definitively proved their methods could yield real constitutional results. However, the British government was not blind to what was happening. They quickly realized the long-term danger of this growing movement, and that initial mild tolerance turned into severe hostility. Take Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India in 1900. He arrogantly stated that Congress was tottering to its fall, and that one of his great ambitions was to assist it to a peaceful demise. Other officials derided the Nationalists as disloyal babus, and called the Congress a literal factory of sedition. The government even started actively encouraging reactionary elements and leaning heavily into a divide-and-rule policy just to counter Congress propaganda. But I want you to juxtapose Lord Curzon's arrogance with this absolutely brilliant quote from Justice M.G. Renede, writing to Gokhale in 1891. He says, "These memorials are nominally addressed to the government. In reality, they are addressed to the people, so that they may learn how to think in these matters." This just perfectly reveals the true genius of the moderate phase. They weren't naive. They fully understood that their polite petitions and legislative debates were actually a strategic educational tool. They were designed to wake up the Indian masses and build a unified political consciousness for the future. Section 6. The Unseen Foundation. Evaluating the Early Nationalists. This brings us to our overall evaluation of this period. How do we actually judge these early nationalists who were so polite, so restricted by law, yet so fundamentally important? Looking at their legacy requires a lot of balance. On one hand, we absolutely must acknowledge their limitations. Their social base was incredibly narrow, mostly comprising the urban upper middle class and zamindars, the wealthy landowners. The masses played a totally passive role during this time because, frankly, these early leaders lacked political faith in the uneducated public. They feared that India's diverse, heterogeneous society just wasn't ready to act as a unified political force. But on the other hand, we absolutely cannot ignore their massive achievements. They pioneered political reform. They single-handedly generated a nationwide, intellectually rigorous anti-imperialist sentiment through the drain theory. And they stood up and represented the emerging Indian nation against vast colonial interests. There's a great quote that beautifully anchors this whole concept. It says, "We cannot blame them for the attitude they adopted as pioneers of Indian political reform any more than we can blame the brick and mortar that is buried 6 feet deep in the foundation and plinth of a modern edifice." The moderates were literally the unseen brick and mortar. They made the entire superstructure of the later freedom struggle, the mass movements, the home rule, and the ultimate demand for complete Swaraj or self-rule entirely possible. So I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. When we think of Indian independence, we almost always think of the massive, radical, roaring mass struggles of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. But could those revolutionary movements have ever actually succeeded without this carefully laid, polite, methodical, and entirely unseen foundation built between 1885 and 1905? The truth is, without the meticulous groundwork of the moderates, the edifice of modern India would have had absolutely nothing to stand on. Thank you for joining me.